Welcome to the seventh episode of the Sport Analytics podcast. Today, we're joined by Yeshayah Goldfarb, who is the former Vice President of Baseball Resource and Development and Vice President of Baseball Operations for the San Francisco Giants. Yeshayah, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for the invite, Amrit.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, great to have you here. And we would love to introduce you a bit. So, over a remarkable 24-year tenure with the organization, rising from an intern to an executive role, Yeshaya has helped lead the team to three World Series championships in 2010, 2012, and 2014. He's been a driving force behind the Giants' player development strategies, analytics innovations, an integral part of player acquisition plus roster construction and infrastructure projects. Now, after recently departing the club, he's here to share insights into his journey, how he oversaw multiple facets of baseball operations, and the lessons he learned along the way. So, we'd love to go straight into questions, and we would love to, ask about your journey. So, could you start by walking us through your path from UC San Diego to landing that first internship with the Giants, and what initially drew you to a career in baseball operations?
Yeah, I'd love to. So I grew up in the Bay Area, and I ended up playing baseball at UC San Diego. So it was always part of my life. My father was a longtime Dodger fan, which would surprise some um, Giants fans on here. But it's I grew up an A's fan in the East Bay, and I think like the three World Series appearances for that team, the Bash brothers, it was just an exciting team to grow up around. So I think that really instilled the passion for me. And then playing at UC San Diego, my senior year, as a lot of college students are trying to figure out what to do with their life, I knew I wasn't going to be able to stay in the game. I was able to play in college basically by dropping down as a sidearmer. It's how I could keep going because I was like 78 to 82. And I could get enough outs to make it. I wasn't that great, but I was able to have a roster spot and just kind of took a leadership role on the team as I, progressed in my time there, and realized I would love to stay in the game. So started sending my resume out to most of the clubs, and then focused on the Bay Area. So I kind of found my network of people I might know in the game. My college coach had a friend who worked for the A's. I did an informational interview with him. My dad knew a local sports writer he went to college with who introduced me to like the head of media at the Giants, who introduced me to like the head of scouting at the Giants. And I did an informational interview with him, or went in there and they were looking for an intern. After a 15-minute conversation, they hired me. So really different world then. I feel lucky for the opportunity. I don't know if they ever posted that position. Um, it was just different at that time. I think the fact that I had played probably got me in the door to some degree, and then you know they were looking for someone as I was like trying to reach out to people I knew. And the game's very different now. I think like one inflection point was just being in the game was probably when Moneyball was published, because it like made it more tangible for people who didn't play, to see that there's a way in and a value for them, which is 100% true. And then over time, as more data came into the game and just like new ways to develop players and understanding the value of like strength and conditioning and nutrition and new biomechanics data, like front offices have gotten much bigger, which you're probably familiar with, but um, we've also expanded beyond like just hiring former players, because there's so much more expertise that are needed beyond that, and baseball can be learned by anybody.
Yeah, that sounds like a really interesting journey. And, obviously you started as an intern, but, you were able to move up, a lot of, positions in the organization to becoming a baseball operations assistant and then into the analytics and video coordination world. What were some of the key milestones or responsibilities that helped you stand out and advance in the organization?
Yeah, we were a small group then. I think just always being available and ready to help. I was usually the first one there, last one to leave. To make ends meet, I actually like park cars sometimes when the team was out of town at night just to like make extra money. It was just kind of the way to like get through, um, and pay rent. But um, I think when you're doing that, and it doesn't matter what you're doing, you become a dependable member of the team, and you start to get more things to do, because you're able to really knock out of the park what you're given, and then you know they don't want to do it, so they're going to pass it on to you in some ways. So that was like probably just like maybe a personal characteristic or something for anybody. It's like you get this opportunity, do everything you can to like to do it. I think the second thing is I always try to learn something every day. And like my first one of the first duties I had as an intern is I entered a ton of scouting reports into our system. So I'm going to really date myself here, but our scouts didn't have computers yet because the Wi-Fi wasn't strong enough at hotels they would be at, and so they would handwrite everything, and they would mail it to me or they would fax it to me. And so I would have this big stack of scouting reports on my desk, and I would data enter them. Probably 3/4 of the time every day. I actually got carpal tunnel syndrome partway through that year and kind of worked through it from all the data entry. But every single report I read or wrote into the system, that was an opportunity to learn something. I learned the language of scouting. I grew an appreciation of it. And then I would often get to see those players at night, whether throughout the big leagues, and I could start to see what they saw. And that was a big part of it. And then when the team was in town, I would go down to the video room, usually 2 to 3 hours before the game. I'd help out our video coordinator in that room, and then I would do a little video replay station off the dugout that players would come and see their at bats or the opposing pitcher that might be coming in, and that was a great way on a completely different setting to learn the game. I was a fly on the wall for conversations. I could ask targeted questions, and through that process, I could always learn something.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. And we'd like to I would like to further that question. Going through like some of the promotions you had later in your career with the Giants. You progressed through roles such as the coordinator of baseball operations, director of minor league operations and quantitative analysis, and ultimately vice president. Which promotions felt most pivotal in shaping your leadership style and strategic perspective?
Hmm. Great question. I think for me, I didn't really like concentrate on like a promotion or what was next. It was just kind of I probably more like acknowledgement of what I was doing more than
Mhm.
anything. So it just kind of happened over time. So I don't really think of like a promotion from director, senior director, a coordinator as like an inflection point in my career, like a
Mhm.
big change. It was just kind of like more doing what I was doing, and probably more responsibility allowed me to like spread my wings a little bit more in spaces. But I think like to answer your leadership style, as I reflect back, my leadership style, like what I believe in leadership, is something I would call flat leadership. And I think I actually developed it as an intern. And I don't know where it came from before that, but um, I like really strongly believe that on a given day, like anyone in an organization can make an impact. And so, like, you know, if you're a clubhouse manager in double A, um, the way you show up to work and the way you can allow players to focus on what they're concentrated on by taking care of other things, even like um, a positive outlook, even saying good morning to everybody can like actually impact, because they're all humans, individuals throughout the day. As like one example, but I would go through like even as a VP, um, you know, I think that intern there can provide things. It's a new perspective. They have their own background. And so players can do the same thing. A trainer, a strength coach, like there's just so many people in the organism that is working to make the Giants a little bit better, or make that player a little bit better, or help make a decision a little bit better, that they all play a major part. And I think instead of looking at those like more top down, if you are a quote unquote have the position of a leader, like letting those voices shine and uplift them, you actually become a much better organization. And then each one of those individuals are going to give more because they are really part of the process, and they can see the impact that they're making. And I approached it the same way even when I was an intern, because in a lot of ways, it's going to sound weird and a little abstract, but in a lot of ways, like, there's an intern on every team, and you want to be better than that intern on every other team, or a trainer on every team. So there's like a way to build competitiveness there with other teams, but not with each other. And so that's kind of the flat leadership style that I believe in. And I think it really like creates a nice mission, and of like we're all kind of pulling the same direction on the road to beat other teams, and it brings the competitive nature into it.
Mhm.
And then I think your second question was around like strategic perspective. Is that right?
Yeah. Hmm.
Um, it's a really good question too. I think like my strategic perspectives improved like as I learned the game. Um,
Hmm.
but they kind of happened from the moment I joined the organization. So,
Yeah.
um, one unique thing about working in baseball, and I would guess other sports and maybe even other businesses have some similarities, is one of the greatest things is that you're really never doing the same thing
Hmm.
as the calendar turns. Like, you're
Yeah.
always going to have a spring training with like a different roster, and then you're going to have the beginning of the season, and then, you know, amateur scouting is happening at the same time, and you're going to have a draft. It used to be in June, now it's July, and you're going to have a trade deadline, and you're going to have, you know, getting ready for minor league free agency. But then also, like, the season is progressing, you might have playoffs. And so you have an off season where you're signing players and you're building your roster. So, like, it changes, but then the next year you get to do the same thing with some different personnel. And so when you're talking about like a strategic perspective, the way I always saw it is, I'm going to get to do spring training again. How can
Hmm.
I do it better the next time?
Yeah.
And so I would often, like, as spring training finished, I would actually like keep a log of ideas for the next spring.
Hmm.
And I would spend time to write them down, and then I would just kind of put it on the shelf. And as I started preparing for the next spring, the next year, you know, then I make them come alive, and there might be new ideas by then. But that's a way to like progress and strategically kind of take it forward.
Hmm.
And then I think the other piece of it, um, about me, and other people may do the same thing, is kind of as I have been transitioning away from the Giants, I spent some time like, I don't remember everything I did, so I spent some time like actually just going through all the documents I created since I've been here, which was kind of an interesting process.
Hmm.
And through that, I could really see my development as a staff member, and like how much more I was doing over time, or like ideas I had that I brought to the table. And I realized through that process that I was really one of our creatives in the office that was kind of pushing us forward in a lot of different directions, which I don't know that I always saw myself that way. It's just who I was. So I have like all these memos I used to write to myself, which I call them like idea brainstorms. And they'd have a list of ideas, and then I could see myself implementing them, whether it's 3 months later, whether it's 6 months later, or a few years later. So, like, for an example, when I was an intern, I have no idea why I wrote this. I have a document that, like, in detail outlines like ideas around integrating Latin players into Arizona when they come over for the first time. I had never like actually been to spring training before, but it was interesting because a lot of those ideas we ended up implementing over the next few years as I like got involved in player development. Another example is, you know, I wrote like a one page, basically like uh, a proposal to do player development plans in 2008, which are super common now. Um, and it was like super detailed. And I remember even sitting down with my boss, Bobby Evans, then, and like talking it through with him, and then ultimately implementing it, you know, a month or two later, like right in spring training. And so there's so many inflection points like that that I can go back and see. And I would consider that, you know, kind of strategic initiative, that sometimes you need some breadth of knowledge to have, but sometimes you're just throwing stuff against the wall. And actually, some of these ideas came from other organizations that might have shared them, and they didn't necessarily have podcasts then, but like in articles or other publications. And I would, like, it's maybe part of my competitive nature, but I would scan like almost everything that went out publicly, because the giants, for me, where I was, we were our own think tank in our group. And
Mhm.
the only way to like learn information outside of your group is either to hire someone and they come in and then you kind of get the idea of what other clubs are doing, or, which we didn't do very often, or what are they giving out publicly about what they're doing, and maybe there's an idea or two that they're doing better than we are that we can utilize.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a really inspiring journey. It's great to see how you developed over time. And those are, I'm sure, really inspiring pieces of advice. Kind of going back to the kind of the like how you mentioned how when you were with the organization, Moneyball, something was coming out. Baseball analytics was starting to grow at a rapid pace. So when you first started implementing analytics like advanced player profiles, roster construction simulations, and new data capture systems, how was it received within the organization, and what strategies helped you build buy-in among scouts and coaches?
Yeah, I think for the most part it was pretty seamless. There may be some individuals that feel differently, but I would be a little surprised. But I think everyone's going to have their own opinion about it. But I never really got like that much pushback around kind of the data analytics we incorporated. I think because I often tried to tailor it to the organization that we were.
Mm,
So I'll give you some examples, and also I think I had like strong relationships with basically every coach and every scout in our organization, and so that like that relationship at the basic level like is going to help. And I was like always made sure I was available to like have that conversation with them and hear their input, because I think I talked about like the flat leadership. Like there were so many ideas that I got from, scouts or coaches in my analytical work, through a conversation, that helped drive some of the stuff I was doing. So I found many of them as like kind of idea generators for me, like problems that they wanted solved that I could solve with data. So I guess like here's a few examples. I talked about the player development plans earlier. So the way I designed it was a lot of it's data oriented. It like shows the strengths and weaknesses of an individual player and gives them kind of like areas for them to improve on. But there's also in the plan, there's a qualitative element to it too. So we had our coaches, kind of outline things around base running, and even details around leads or things defensively that analytics did not do a good job at that time to describe. And
mm,
so when you're developing players, like all those parts matter. And then when we would sit down with the players and have those conversations about areas they can improve, I led a lot of them, but I would also be sitting there with our hitting coordinator, or a pitching coordinator or other coaches that might be working with that player. And so it was more of a conversation. And I think that ended up being a pretty good strategy where the player could speak to things. And also, like, just to tell a player that they need to walk more is not that informative. It doesn't include the how, as an example. Like, there's usually numbers behind that. And there's also an organization is not necessarily telling them to walk more. They might be telling them to, like, talk through like what is your approach and what can you change in your approach, and if that approach changes then it may lead to more walks,
mm.
because you don't necessarily want a passive hitter all of a sudden. But
Yeah.
if you can show a player, for example, like they're swinging outside the zone over 50% of the time on three ball counts, like that's an approach that can pretty easily be changed. That's
Mhm.
probably an extreme example, but there's examples throughout it. So I think in the player development plan, that's an example. I think you asked about roster construction.
Mhm.
Um, an example in that space is like our first roster construction simulation actually happened I still remember it. We had an organizational meeting in 2009. It was right when Bill Newcomb took over, who was our took over as the president of the Giants, and Ryan Sabian was there, and one of them asked, like, is there a way to predict basically the number of runs we're going to score next year and the runner number of runs we're going to allow, and like predict basically what our record is, and I was like, yeah, there is. And that drove it. And by the next morning, I had some answers for them. And then from there, it really progressed to something that we utilized for a few years within our roster construction. There's been some good books written about it. There's a ton of stuff publicly available around like projecting runs, but it is helpful if you're like making a decision about making a big investment in, let's say, a free agent that might jump your roster potentially to, let's say, 3 wins. Like, there's a big difference between that. And there's also needs to be an acknowledgement that it's a very inexact science, and that like you're going to end up being quite off on given years because you can't necessarily predict injuries or other things, but
Yeah.
depth can help in other areas. So that was kind of an example. I think in the draft room, where like maybe you're asking about like how you're not stepping on toes, or like how it like works together, is I was very close, and I always have been, with Dick Tidrow, who is our head of player development and also our head of amateur scouting. And he's a scout, but he was very creative like me, and he always wanted my opinion and utilized my analytics in the draft room. So I was kind of our Moneyball person for many years, and an example of his trust in me. I remember one draft, we got to the fourth round, and he really liked these 3 pitchers, and he put them on the board. Like, this is as the draft is going. And he said, like, what order would you put them in, to me? Because he wanted to get all of them. And I was like, well, I like these 3 in these order, but I wouldn't take them in that order. I would take him in a different order. And my reasoning was every other team has an analytics person. And so I ended up putting them in order of who had the most data, because I felt like at that moment in time, the people that had more data is going to be on more people's radar. And they had different qualities. And we ended up getting all 3
Oh,
as an example. So one of them was injured, one of them threw almost 100. They were just different variables, but it's an example of like that trust and that coercion. And like, as we were putting together even the draft board, like my opinion on each of those players analytically is being heard. And now with the Giants, Paul Bien does it for Michael Holmes, and Paul does an unbelievable job. And Michael, like, um, you know he wants that information, he craves it, to help make a better decision. So it's
yeah.
it's always been pretty well, kind of cohesive, at least in our organization.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to see how both the quantitative and qualitative aspects come together, whether it comes to player evaluations or anything else in baseball. Obviously, like I mentioned in your intro, you were with the Giants for the 2010, 2012, and 2014 championships. Could you share a few behind the scenes examples of how your analytics or operational decisions contribute to those title runs?
Yeah, this may be a little less exciting for maybe some listeners, but we really did a good job during that time, building depth on our roster through like minor league free agents, at a basic level. So a lot of them have become household names. Like, we all know the big names, the Posies and the Sandovals and the Canes and the Linscombs and the Bumgarners, but you also need like a supporting cast that can make a difference. So maybe a couple examples, and the analytics were used and the scouts were used in both of them. But like Gregor Blanco, who's a known center fielder, made an impact during our one of our World Series runs. And he was, you start minor league free agents, you go through all the players, and he was identified by one of our scouts that year as an everyday player, which he had never been. He had like struggled kind of breaking into the big leagues, but the scout really thought he could play center field. He had an idea at the plate, and then analytically, um, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I remember like batting average was very low, but analytically that's like less as important of a number, and that can fluctuate a lot. But he really controlled the strike zone, and he had you know a much higher on base percentage than his batting average would expect because he walked a ton and he really worked the count. And so you're talking about in minor league free agency, you're talking about a potential middle of the diamond hitter who can get on base and play the position. That's pretty exciting. And so he was one of our top targets, and we ended up getting him and bringing him in. So that's kind of an example of how they work together. Another one that comes to mind is Yasmero Petit, who almost threw a perfect game for us during his run with us. He got to the ninth inning. It was a line drive that bounced at Hunter Pence's feet. I still remember it. He also has the major league record for most consecutive outs of 48 straight outs for a pitcher in the history of baseball. So he was an unbelievable player for us. And he was a former prospect that had trouble breaking in. And, during the off season, a few times a week, I would always scan all the winter league stats because players will pop. Sometimes injured players would come back, and I remember seeing Petit. You know, he had maybe only made 2 or 3 starts, but he had like, I'm going to make this up, but it was something like 9 innings pitched, but like 14 strikeouts and 1 walk. Was a great command pitcher, and then at the same time, one of our coaches, who was an unbelievable scout, Jose Ayusil, and he used to work in the Venezuelan Winter League, and he also messaged us and was like, "Hey, you should take a look at this." So it was like an example of them kind of coming together at the same time, and we signed him, and then he was one of the best kind of bridge pitchers during that year, where he could be the long man on day, he could get critical outs in the game, he could start for you, just kind of a very unique tool set. And he always was the same. He'd come out and throw strikes. And then we learned analytically when TrackMan came out that he was one of the largest extension guys at like 7'4", even though his height is probably 5'11".
Mhm.
So
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, and kind of, building up on that, part of your role involved, managing budgets for player development, analytics, and technology. How did you prioritize spending across these areas to maximize on-field success while also staying within the organizational constraints?
yeah, I think the Giants have been great through the years. Really, if we put the time in to like really analyze why it's valuable and make a pitch for it, the Giants have. I can't really think of maybe many examples where they've said no to it.
Mhm.
They might push it back a year because it wasn't planned for. I think one budgeting challenge around technology is I often see it on like 6 month cycles instead of
Mhm.
year cycles. Just new technology will come out that's really interesting and we need to investigate. And a lot of investigations don't end up to purchasing, but sometimes they do. And I always believed like it was important to be first movers if you really believe in the technology because you could get a small advantage over a period of time. The challenge about being a first mover is sometimes you are wrong, or almost all the time you're going to have to work out kinks with that technology. There's going to be bugs, there's going to be challenges integrating it. So it really depends on what the technology was. But like for example, um, I had gotten the heads up about Hawkeye coming to Major League Baseball pretty early, and we reached out to them, and we were the first team to like sign a contract with them to put it in 4 of our minor league stadiums. And Hawkeye is very expensive, and it was actually in the transition from Bobby to Farhan, and Farhan came in and was excited about us having Hawkeye too. So we were the first mover on them, and it took longer than we were hoping for like really the data to come out and be valuable for us, just because we were the first mover and there's just a lot of pain early on. It's a very complicated technology. They've worked out a lot of the kinks, but all of these complicated ones are always going to improve over time. But that's like an example of the Giants being willing to move forward with a technology that like we believe in and say is valuable. So I know that other organizations may treat it differently, but it's never been like a major hindrance for us.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. And you spent nearly a quarter century with one MLB franchise, which I think is very rare, within the baseball world. And obviously, you had great moments like winning those three World Series. But what were some of the biggest challenges you faced, and what moments also stand out as the most rewarding?
Phew. Um, it really sucks to have a losing season. Like, I'm not gonna lie, it's like it's a driver. It's why you do this. And so I would say anytime we don't make the playoffs, and definitely ones where we know early we don't, which luckily we haven't had too many of those. It's you feel it,
Mhm.
and it just drives you to get back there. So I always bring it back to winning and losing. It's like why you do that. So I think like there are times in the organization where we never did a rebuild, and it's not what the organization believes in. But there were kind of inflection points. I wouldn't say they're frustrating, but they were like just moments in time. Like rosters are going to turn over. So like one inflection point roster wise was like the last year of Bonds, where we were we were close to 500 a lot of those years, and we were kind of building a team that was they ended up being a little bit older because they needed to be major league ready because we're trying to win in those last years and we didn't have the young players to do it. And then um, we ended up drafting really well near the end of that because we had some seasons like the Posey year. We had the fifth overall pick, so we didn't have a very good year that year. We drafted Linscomb 10th overall. We drafted Bumgarner 10th overall. So that's like some of the best drafts in a row. We drafted Wheeler sixth overall. So like as a run of drafts, those are maybe some of the best in Major League history in terms of first round picks. So we hit on them, but also um, we could see those players coming and the value of them. But it sucks to lose during that time too. So it creates opportunity. And I would say in some ways in the transition from Bobby to Farhan, we were going through a similar thing. We had like a core World Series team of players that were getting older at the same time. We had financial constraints because we were up against the CBT, and we didn't have like the young players to fill in the gaps.
Mhm.
And Farhan did an unbelievable job in 2021 when we won 107 games. He really built like depth around those players. It's something like I really learned a lot from him around that, like how he builds depth. And we were able to kind of like speed up that process.
Mhm.
And obviously, the players, Posey and Crawford had really career years at older ages, and
Yeah.
other players were major contributors too. And Webby came into his own then, so there were some young players that were beginning to contribute. Duvall came into his own that year, and a few others. Um, so I think that there's a lot of reward in that, but it's not fun to lose. In terms of rewarding piece, I would say there is nothing like I would say fans would agree too, like winning a World Series. Um,
Yeah.
I think from like the inside perspective, it is pretty amazing to like look around the field and see all the players on the field and like know their history. So every time a player makes it to the big leagues, like they obviously have a mom and a dad. They grew up somewhere. They have a story, and a lot of these stories are long and turning. Ryan Vogelsong, we traded for Jason Schmidt in like 2003, one of the best trades we ever made. He has a long journey, including injuries, including going to Japan, including coming back. We signed him as a minor league free agent, I think in 2009, and then he is like a key contributor to our World Series runs. Like that is unbelievable. So to look there and know that history, but then from the inside, you also know, the 200 plus staff that like have had an impact on those players that are on the field. It's the area scout in Venezuela who first saw Pablo Sandoval and recommends him, right? It's like every single coach that worked with Pablo, you know, from when he was 17 to that day on the field. And they're all pulling for them. And so like that is unbelievable, just the stories and what went there and like kind of the blood, sweat, and tears. And it really is the entire organization that gets there. Brian has a great quote just that he says it takes a village. And I really think that's true.
Mhm.
And it really takes like the entire group impacting each one of those players. The players are the ones that do it. But there is a group that's kind of putting them together and getting them together and putting them on the field together and developing them and evaluating them. So it's it's really a team effort, and that's what drives me every day is to like get that feeling again.
Yeah, that feeling must have been unbelievable. And kind of wanted to ask about, with the rapid evolution of data tracking systems, advanced metrics, and sports science, where do you see MLB analytics heading in the next 5 to 10 years, especially in terms of player development and roster management?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say like the R&D departments for major league teams, they grow as data grows
Mhm.
and expertise grows as data grows. So, in recent years, every team has a biomechanist on staff. Some have as many as four. A lot of teams are now hiring people with like machine learning and like visual abilities, like both with video, but to like show things visually with data, kind of like what Baseball Savant would show,
Mhm.
but for their internal systems, because that's where the data has moved. So I think that's going to continue to progress. I think like the one hole right now with data is that we only have it at the major league level and the minor league level. And maybe a few targeted college places are going to begin to have it. So um, I think that a lot of these, technology data companies are going to find new ways to make it like more affordable at the college level and the high school level, which will impact decisions at those levels, including like in baseball academies in Venezuela and Dominican Republic. So when we're looking at frankly 12, 13, 14, 15 year olds, the data is going to get a little bit better on them that we're looking at. And so that will probably progress in that direction.
Mhm.
um, Trying to think other areas. I mean, biomechanics is going to continue to like progress the value of it, and it really overlaps well with coaches, because coaches are often looking at how the player moves. So I think that that'll continue to increase, including like visual data around biomechanics. For example, um, many of your viewers may know what like pitch design is,
Mhm.
and like that has become a standard in baseball that hasn't necessarily hit like every college, for example. So there's still areas where like you can get a player in and develop them quickly because they haven't been exposed to it. I mean, the next space probably in the near term is the hitting side, where there's a lot more biomechanical data on hitters. Every major league stadium is capturing biomechanics on the swing and the bat and the way the body moves. And so I think every team is like racing to find valuable information in there, both evaluation wise and development wise. And
Mhm.
so that is a race that's happening right now, and some are probably farther than others. And that kind of hitting is one of the hardest things to do in sports. And so anything you can do to just help a little bit um, will probably help and counter what the pitchers are throwing at them, which is some some pretty amazing pitches.
Yeah, I think it's amazing to see, the potential that baseball analytics and sports analytics has in general for, the next few years. I want to end off by asking this final question, and this is kind of, asking for your advice to viewers and us as an organization. What core skills, experiences, or mindsets would you recommend, our viewers develop to thrive in the modern front office, and what, skills do you think we can maybe include in our certification courses that can help them achieve that?
Great question. I think at the basic level, have a passion for the game. That's not a skill. And I would guess anyone listening to this probably has some of that. And being a learner, um, being willing to ask those questions that if you don't know something, ask. Like people are willing to answer them. You can also like write down something someone says. It could be a term you don't know. Write it down and then look it up later and learn about it, or ask them if you can't at that moment. So like some of the smartest people I've ever been around ask a lot of questions, and they find good moments to do that. So that would be like just one thing, is just like learn. You don't have to be you don't have to have permission from an organization, meaning you don't have to be hired by a major league team to start gaining these skills. I think some people see it that way. So what your organization does is great. I would go through job descriptions that you see publicly out there, like in the off season, and teams do a really good job telling applicants like what they're looking for. Most applicants, they don't expect to like be masters at those areas when they get them, but it's good to know that like if you're going to apply to be an analyst, most analysts have at least a basic understanding of R or Python and SQL to some degree, as an example. But you can obviously separate yourself, um, or I wouldn't say separate yourself. I would say like the better you get at it, you'll be able to hit the ground running a little bit faster when you get the job. I think, I get asked like people that want to be scouts a lot, like, how do you scout and like, how do you get experience? And I would say, just go do it. Like, there's a lot of available information on podcasts. There's example forums online. Go to a game, start writing your evaluations of them. I have someone who works for the Giants now. His name's Sam Gainey. He went to my high school about 10 years after I did. And he's a longtime scout. He ran player development for the Padres. He was an international scout for the A's for a long time. I think he helped sign Cespedes. But his story is he was at Cal and he wanted to work in baseball. So he literally every weekend would just go to Cali games, write reports on all the players, post them online, meet the scouts, and that was his way in. So you don't need permission to start learning it. And then I think be curious. Whatever you learn, whether it's like biomechanics or analytics or coaching, you may not like that, might not be your like core area, but you'll probably interact with people that is their core area, or that's what their expertise in, and it is valuable to know that stuff. I think one specific skill I wish I had was speaking Spanish. So anyone who has that skill or will put the time in to learn it, it'll be valuable. You'll notice immediately when you enter pro ball that communication is a big, big deal in baseball. There's a lot of people doing a lot of different things, and being able to communicate is everything. And Spanish can be a prohibitor, particularly if you're working with international scouts or international players. To like really get your point across, or to like just have a conversation to learn from them and see who they are.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Yeshayah. I mean, your insights and advice have been really valuable, and I hope our viewers put it to good use. And thanks a lot to our viewers for tuning in. We've already had 8 great episodes with professionals in the sports analytics field. Talk to us, and we have many more episodes coming out soon. Thanks a lot again, Yeshayah, and thanks a lot. Yeah.
All right,
Yeah.
perfect.
Thank you. Yeah.
Appreciate the time.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you too.